Mother Marika, a curse upon thee.
In the shadow of the Erdtree, where history lies buried like embers, a forgotten war ignites a new narrative. The expansion, Shadow of the Erdtree, weaves a tapestry of compelling chronicles, from the ancestral saga of the Hornsent people to the shamanic origins of Queen Marika herself, while the journey culminates in a fated clash with Mikhella the Kind and his consort. It is another of Marika's children who stands as the expansion's grim figurehead. Mesmer the Impaler, who with his fiery spear led a merciless crusade upon the land. Within this shadowed realm, Mesmer's campaign is the foundational wound, the ancient lore upon which Mikhella's present pilgrimage is built. Though he plays a supporting role to the main quest, Mesmer's personal history and his war are among the most lore-dense epics in the entire expansion. His story serves as a dark prism, refracting our understanding of Marika, the tangled politics of her divine family, and the very nature of Lendel's dominion. His tale also summons the Abyssal Serpent from the depths, breathing new life into the discourse on the world's eternal struggle between light and dark. In his mother's name, Mesmer committed atrocities, only to be spurned and cast aside for a Graceless tarnished, a final, bitter insult to a son who sacrificed his freedom, his morality, and ultimately his life to purge the world of that which his mother came to favor. Though Mesmer's actions are undeniably monstrous, he possesses the nuance and depth that defines the world of Elden Ring. To truly grasp the richness of this new chapter, one must delve into the story of Mesmer and his war, for his forgotten lore is the key that unlocks the deepest secrets of the Shadowland. In the lead-up to the DLC's release, trailers and interviews with director Miyazaki led to the widespread belief that Mesmer was a previously unknown child of Marika. This has indeed been confirmed as true. Numerous sources identify him as her son, including Mesmer himself, who curses his mother Marika at the moment of his death.
Mother Marika, a curse upon thee.
For the sake of complete confirmation, the Serpent crest shield provides a direct source, stating, a finely made red shield featuring an engraving of a winged serpent, excels at guarding against fire. Said to have been made to commemorate the beginnings of the Crusade started by Mesmer, son of Marika. If Mesmer is a son of Marika, the question of his generational placement among the other demi-god children arises. Clues within the game's lore help to position him in the timeline. For instance, Gaius's remembrance identifies him as an elder to Radahn, which means Mesmer must predate Radagon's marriage to Rennala and the children born from that union. However, it is unlikely that he is a product of Godfrey and Marika's marriage, the so-called Golden Lineage. Firstly, members of the Golden Lineage are almost always identified as such. It is a core part of their identity. Even Morgott, the Omen king of Lendel, has a reference to the Golden Lineage in his Great Rune. If Mesmer were part of this lineage, one would expect to find some mention of it in his lore, but none exists. Additionally, Mesmer exhibits several characteristics typical of children born from the union of Radagon and Marika. The first letter of his name aligns with the naming convention for their children. It is also believed that Melina is a child of Radagon and Marika, and her name too begins with M. Perhaps more significantly, Mesmer has vibrant red hair, one of the most prominent features shared by the children of Radagon. Mesmer shares another trait with Mikhella and Malenia. He was born with a curse. Malenia's remembrance connects her and Mikhella's curse to the circumstances of their birth, stating, Mikhella and Malenia are both the children of a single god. As such, they are both Empyrean, but suffered afflictions from birth. This implies a causal link between their afflictions and their parentage, a reference to Radagon and Marika being a single, two-spected deity. This is likely a thematic commentary on the practice of inbreeding common in real-world medieval dynasties, which led to numerous birth defects, though in Elden Ring these curses are cosmic in nature. If Mesmer shares the same heritage as Mikhella and Malenia, it stands to reason that he too would bear a similar curse, and indeed he does. He is the host to a flame and an abyssal serpent. We know he was born with this curse, as Gaius's remembrance reads. Both were his elder brothers to the lion, and both were cursed from birth. Unfortunately, Mesmer's father is never explicitly mentioned in his lore, so his identity remains a matter of speculation. However, considering his red hair, the naming convention, and his congenital curse, it is highly likely that Mesmer is another child born of Radagon and Marika, but from an earlier, previously unknown generation. Mikhella and Malenia were born after Radagon's marriage to Rennala upon his return to Lindel to become Elden Lord. Therefore, if Mesmer is older than Radahn, he must have been born from the Radagon-Marika union in a generation we were previously unaware of. This is why a theoretical generational chart might place Mesmer as the earliest, predating even the Golden Lineage. This could have occurred before Marika married her consort, Godfrey. While speculative, it seems unlikely she would be having children with her other half, Radagon, while married to her new lord consort. Furthermore, we know Mesmer had a younger sister, a fact alluded to in Mesmer's kindling, which reads, "The kindling that burned inside Mesmer the Impaler, a dark thing eaten away at by a wicked serpent. Mesmer, much like his younger sister, bore a vision of fire." It is important to address a rumor that this reference to a sister was secretly patched out of the game. In reality, the pre-release version of the game given to reviewers did not mention a sister, however. The launch day patch added this reference, and it has remained in the game ever since. This is the legitimate and intended version of the item description. With that clarified, Mesmer had another sister who also had a connection to fire, and this can be none other than Melina. It has long been suspected that Melina is a daughter of Marika. She never states it outright, but hints at it strongly when she says, "I'm searching for my purpose, given to me by my mother inside the Erdtree long ago, for the reason that I yet live, burned and bodiless." This mother within the Erdtree must be Queen Marika. The question of Melina's place among the demi-god generations may now be answered. She is part of this previously unknown generation of fire. This theory is reinforced by circumstantial evidence. A new incantation in the DLC, Minor Erdtree, is described as a secret incantation of Queen Marika, relevant to her early history. Melina is the only character in the game who uses this secret incantation, summoning her to assist in the fight against Morgott. This suggests a close relationship with Marika, positioning her as one of the earlier children who was privy to the ancient parts of her mother's history. Returning to the description of Mesmer's kindling, it mentions that this younger sister had a relationship with and visions of fire. Melina has 3 potential connections to fire. First, she can become the kindling used to burn the Erdtree on the player's journey. Second, her body was burned, leaving her burned and bodiless. And third, she is likely the gloam-eyed queen who wielded the black flame of death against the gods. These connections strongly suggest she is the sister mentioned. Melina's status as burned and bodiless, her imprisonment in a cell near the Forsaken Lands where her blade is found, and her familiarity with destined death all point to a complex and tragic history. The most telling piece of evidence is her revealing a purple gloam eye in the frenzied flame ending, while threatening the player with destined death. The reference in Mesmer's kindling strengthens the case that Melina is Marika's daughter and possessed visions of fire from her youth. It makes sense why both Melina and Mesmer are forgotten figures, not celebrated members of the pantheon. Mesmer was born with a darkness within him and was exiled to the land of shadow, while Melina once led the horrifying godskin apostasy and rebellion. As members of the royal family, they were likely struck from the historical record, figures the Golden Lineage would rather forget. Previously, there was little evidence of interaction between the different generations of demigods, aside from Mikhella's deep affection for Godwyn. Now, the remembrance of a god and a lord reveals that Mikhella's youth overlapped with Radahn's younger years. Although the span of years between generations and the lifespan of demigods are unknown. It seems they lived long enough for these interactions to be possible. It now makes sense that Mikhella and Malenia were born close enough to Renella's children to at least know each other in passing. The resurrected Radahn seen at the end of the DLC from his remembrance is Radahn before the Starscourge conflict. This is likely the age at which Mikhella most vividly remembers him, which is why the power of Mikhella resurrects him at this particular age, rather than in his later years. Radahn appears to be a central figure in this family dynamic. If Mesmer is the oldest sibling and interacted with Radahn as an older brother, and Mikhella is one of the youngest and also mingled with Radahn, it is reasonable to assume that all the different generations of demigods interacted with one another. It is unfortunate that the DLC did not feature an interaction between Mikhella and Mesmer as the younger brother passed through his elder's domain. This shows that Mesmer was present in the capital at least until the time Radagon married Renala. It was likely during the period after the Radagon-Renala marriage that Mesmer would interact with another royal, R'hllana. R'hllana would eventually become one of Mesmer's most loyal followers, with her remembrance naming her as Mesmer's Blade. She was loyal enough to give up her titles and claims to royalty. This devotion would not have developed in a vacuum. She must have known him well. Therefore, it is fair to assume that after Renala tied her house to the Lendel royal family, there was some intermingling and sharing of duties between the two families, during which R'hllana and Mesmer would have met. Now, with a better understanding of Mesmer's place in the royal family tree, it is time to return to the curse mentioned earlier, the Abyssal Serpent. Mesmer's curse is something we witness during the second stage of his fight, when he merges with the base serpent contained within him. The Abyssal Serpent is a creature that was sealed behind his eye by his mother, Marika. His remembrance reads, "A malevolent snake wed within Mesmer," and so his very mother plucked out his eye and put in its place a seal of grace. Indeed, Mesmer's eye is essentially the same model as Marika's rune, indicating that Marika's power is what holds the Abyssal Serpent in place within his eye socket. In the second stage of the fight, when Mesmer plucks out this eye and shatters it, it breaks into golden flakes, reinforcing the fact that it is not an eye at all, but an artifact constructed entirely of grace. This is the first indication that the power of the Abyss, or Dark, is an opposing force to grace. The Abyss is a fascinating subject because it brings the importance of the Dark to the forefront of Elden Ring's lore. There are two key takeaways about the Abyss. First, it represents the Dark, which is an opposing force to light and grace. While the relationship between light and dark is more prominent in Dark Souls, it is still very much present in Elden Ring, especially now in this DLC. The second point is that the Abyss is often related to the cosmos, the dark void of space, which in Elden Ring is the domain of celestial and cosmic beings. There is not much in-game lore that talks directly about the Abyssal Serpent, however. Mesmer says something of this serpent during his Stage 2 transition. "I will not suffer our Lord devoid of light, no."
No, Mother. Forgive me. Soon tarnished. Wilt thou be taken in the jaws of the Abyssal Serpent, shorn of light?
The phrase, shorn of light, means cut off from light, emphasizing the role the Abyss plays in Elden Ring's lore as the opposite of light. It is the bottomless dark, entirely absent of light. The concept of the Abyss and Serpents is not new to From Software. The Abyss was a major component of Dark Souls lore, where we were first introduced to it via Kath, the primordial serpent. The Dark Souls world was once one of uniformity, a gray world where everything was the same. Then came the advent of fire, a cosmic event that upended the rules of the universe, creating a world of duality and disparity, life and death, heat and cold, light and dark. At the beginning of the Age of Fire, 4 great souls were found within the flame, 2 pairs of opposites, the soul of chaos, i.e., life, and the soul of death making up 1 pair, and the soul of light and the soul of dark. The abyss is essentially a consequence of light and a manifestation of the dark. While the abyss in Dark Souls is incredibly complicated, some of the most relevant ties are its opposing nature to light and its natural connection to the abyss of space. The void of space itself is a dark plane of existence that is absent light and is often referred to as the abyss. As we look at the abyssal serpent further, these are the most relevant allusions we can draw in Elden Ring as well. The symbology behind the abyssal serpent is deeply rooted in concepts like alchemy. The idea of reconciling opposite halves, usually represented by red and white, is a recurring concept in From Software games, but even more so in Elden Ring with the idea of Marika and Radagon, the White Queen and the Red King, merging to form the Rebis, the personification of the Philosopher's Stone, the ultimate goal of alchemy. However, there is also the bonding agent needed to bring these 2 halves together, the god Mercurius. Mercurius is represented in many ways, with 2 main examples being the void or space and 2 intertwining snakes, or the caduceus. In both Elden Ring and Dark Souls, we have a snake and the abyss associated with the force of darkness, leaving no doubt about the source of inspiration. This helps explain why snakes and the abyss go together in both games. Alchemically, the cosmos or the void is described as the base material that binds everything together, hence the base serpent of Mesmer. While the abyss has its own in-game lore, it is undeniable that we are meant to think of the void and the dark expanse of space, especially when we consider that even in the base game of Elden Ring, there are references to the abyss and darkness tied to the cosmos and celestial beings. The lore surrounding Astel, a living malformed star, often refers to the cosmos in a similar way. In fact, the original Japanese for Astel could be translated as Astel, spawn of darkness, rather than natural born of the void, which highlights this connection. When you use Astel's remembrance, you can create waves of darkness, an ash of war, with the powers of the void manifesting as dark energy, an attack Astel himself can use. This again connects the celestial to darkness and the abyss. The specific term abyss is used once in the base game, in the description of Comet Azur, in reference to Azur peering through the primeval current and into the abyss of space. Now, in the DLC, we get further ties between the abyss and this concept of darkness. We find this in the Sword Hands of Night, for example, Yolan and Ansbach. Their master, Ansbach, is a thinker of Carian origin who thinks deeply on the cosmos and its relation to the greater will. Thus, his greatest weapons are a reflection of the dark cosmos of the abyss of space absent light. Yolan and Ansbach's ash reeds together. Yolan's swords and Ansbach's claws are as bottomless black and penetrate the enemy's guard. Yolan and Ansbach were born in a cold, dark jail, where they were raised deprived of light to be Sword Hands of Night. Everything about these 2 is meant to reflect a dark absent of light. Essentially the abyss of space, their weapons are bottomless black. And like space, the weapons are incorporeal and thus pass through shields and blocks. They were even raised in a jail to be deprived of light to reflect that darkness of the cosmos. All of this is to say that there are elements of Elden Ring that touch on this idea of an abyss that is often related to the cosmic realm. However, unlike the other references to the abyss or cosmos, which focus on the beings that exist within this void, the abyssal serpent seems to be a manifestation of that darkness itself. Perhaps this is enough to go on. Perhaps the abyssal serpent is just another cosmic being, an outer god of the void, or the vassal of an outer god. Malenia has the scarlet rot within her, the influence of an outer god, and thus it is possible that Mesmer, another demi-god of the same lineage, also caught the attention of some creature of an outer god, and as such, it took root within him like a parasite, a tapeworm of unfathomable power that has been with him since his birth. The serpent is cosmic in its behaviors. Behind Mesmer's eye, there is a dark void, an abyss that seems to go deeper than is physically possible within his head. You can see the snake coiled within his eye, and yet when the serpent manifests fully, it is massive. So, while the base serpent inhabits a relatively small space within Mesmer's eye socket, clearly there are some spatial anomalies at play, pointing to the fact that this is a cosmic creature beyond the normal rules of the terrestrial realm. The aesthetic choices for the serpent also line up somewhat with the elements of Dark Souls, again perhaps implying it has a similar nature to the abyss of that game. We can see red eyes that line its body, and when it summons duplicates, they too have these multiple red eyes. These multiple red eyes are reminiscent of Manus and the Olisel residents. Just as dark was the opposing force of light in Dark Souls, the DLC reinforces the opposing forces of light and dark as well. Grace, the Erdtree, and other things relating to the greater will are the representatives of light, life, and order, whereas on the other side, we have things such as dark, disorder, and chaos. The base game focused more on the differences between life and death, with the removal of the rune of death, and the place of death being a major focus of the lore. But the remembrance of the Scadutree avatar makes it clear that everything contrary to the Erdtree is reflected and contained within the Scadutree and the realm of shadow. It reads, "The Scadutree is the shadow of the Erdtree, born of dark notions that bear no sense of order, that twist and bend its stalk, rendering it brittle." Dark notions that bear no sense of order is a very interesting use of words. The Erdtree, the Elden Ring, and the Greater Will are often associated with order, essentially everything gold. The Elden Beast's remembrance even tells us that the beast and the Elden Ring were the embodiment of order. In each of the Elden Lord endings, we repair the Elden Ring and bring about a new age. The configuration of the Elden Ring can be very different in each variant, but one thing unites them: we bring order back to the world. Indeed, in symbology, dark is often associated with disorder and chaos, whereas light is often associated with order and structure, as it is in the system of yin and yang, and as it was in Dark Souls. Dark is a force in the cosmic rules of Elden Ring, and it is partially represented and contained by the Scadutree, given it is the shadow or dark of the Erdtree, which is the light to the world. There is another display of the power of the dark in the DLC that we can potentially tie to the Scadutree: the obscuring of Ener Illim by the Sealing Tree, which seems to coat the tower in dark. We know from Impaler's catacombs that it was Marika's people who sealed the tower in shadow. Our lands were by thy kind set aflame, our tower by thy kind veiled in shadow. Shadow is essentially the power of obscuring, of hiding things from the light. But how were they able to do this? An interesting observation is that the Sealing Tree is actually the same shape as half of the Scadutree. To me, the implication is clear. Marika's followers used the dark power within the Scadutree to obscure the tower. The Scadutree is the vessel for dark and shadow, thus, it is these powers that are being utilized here. In the DLC, we start to get further emphasis on the Erdtree and Grace's relation to light, mainly through Sir Mesmer's dogma and dialogue. When he recognizes that we, Marika's Lord-elect, are tarnished, he reacts with surprise.
Wouldst thou truly lordship sanction in one so bereft of light?
The way he describes us here is very interesting. Not bereft of grace, but bereft of light. He sees grace and the lack of it in terms of light and dark, and it might not be too surprising that he thinks of it in this way, given the darkness that he has within himself. Indeed, this seems to be reinforced by his lines, "Should he kill you in stage 2 of his fight? O lightless creature, embrace thine oblivion, as shall I." Perhaps his grace of purity dogma is one born of self-hatred for the lightless void that exists within him, being an opposite force to grace. Indeed, further evidence that the abyss stands in opposition to grace and the Erdtree is the very fact that Marika's seal of grace is successful in holding back the serpent. Her light holds back the abyss within Mesmer, and there are hints that this opposing duality of light and dark goes further back than even the Erdtree. We can find the swords of darkness and light within this new DLC. The base variant of these swords, the Stone Sheath Sword, tells us that this is an artifact of an ancient civilization. And given that Ra lies within these lands, and one of the altars, the Altar of Light, is found there, it must be a remnant of that civilization. Thus, the representation of light and dark predates the Erdtree. Given Ra was an ancient civilization, it's just that the Erdtree is the most recent representation of order, light, and life. But dark and light have always existed in the world of Elden Ring. I therefore find it fascinating that the DLC focuses so heavily on this concept, and ultimately, I see the Serpent as a manifestation of darkness and the void, a cosmic being that draws on the power of darkness, and until now has been held back by the power of grace and light. Now, let's discuss how the Abyssal Serpent affected Mesmer's flame. Mesmer's kindling calls his flame a dark thing that has been eaten away at by the Abyssal Serpent. We have talked in detail about the power of the dark that exists in Elden Ring, and that the Abyssal Serpent is a coalescence of that power. As such, it's no surprise that the fire within Mesmer has also been afflicted by the abyss, by the dark of the Serpent. This is why it has a slightly dark coloring to it, and it's why Mesmer's flame can be used for other things, like necromancy, a fact we'll get into later. Additionally, the Serpent's relationship to Mesmer's flame can be seen in the way that it manifests. The flame spreads out, coils, and moves like a serpent, with the amber of Mesmer even being described as taking a serpentine form. This just really emphasizes the sheer power of this creature that's within Mesmer. It has made his flame truly unique, dark, and serpentine in nature. Mesmer's orb tells us how Mesmer despised his own flame. I initially assumed this was just because of how fire is viewed in Erdtree society, given the burning of the Erdtree is viewed as the first cardinal sin, and fire in general is viewed unfavorably. However, on reflection and after writing about the Abyssal Serpent, I can't help but think the reason Mesmer hated his fire so much was because it would always be a reminder of the darkness that lies within him, the blasphemous abyss. The parasitic nature of the Serpent is also illustrated in the way that it and Mesmer seem to become one when the seal of grace is removed. After all, in the second phase, he is called Base Serpent Mesmer. They are one being. They move as one, with the Abyssal Serpent sometimes taking control before ceding it back to Mesmer. Mesmer's orb is one of his signature moves in Stage 1. It's the one he opens with usually, where he dives into the air before bringing an orb down upon the enemy. However, in Stage 2, the Abyssal Serpent also opens with this move before the Abyssal Serpent melts away and Mesmer is left standing there. They are one and the same. If you look carefully at the Abyssal Serpent, you will see that it is missing an eye, and the reason it's missing an eye is because Mesmer is now also missing an eye. They are one and the same being in this Stage 2. There are other signs of how they are one and the same. If you look at the Serpent's body, you can see Mesmer's red hair all over it, and in Stage 2, Mesmer's skin has become mottled like the snake skin that has possessed his body. They are not fighting alongside each other, they are one. This is what Marika has prevented all these years with the power of grace and light. The Abyssal Serpent was there, yes, but it didn't take over Mesmer. The power of light held back the dark from consuming Mesmer entirely, although it did eat away at his flame. No wonder the Hornsent gets such sadistic pleasure in seeing the nightmare of his people reduced so. Upon his end, he says, "Did you see Mesmer's face? For sublime, a very tangle of snakes, to think he dared call us savages, when he himself was most base of all." Now that we've talked about the abyssal aspect of the base serpent, there are some further observations I want to make about serpents in general. The first is how Mesmer's winged serpents play into all of this. I find the winged serpent helm a good place to start, as it reads the following: Helm of Cud, Captain of the Fire Knights. A winged serpent perches atop it. The the winged serpent is a token creature of Mesmer's military forces. It is a wise friend, which keeps the base serpent at bay and holds its power in check. These serpents do not seem to be connected to the base serpents. They are companions of Mesmer, wrapped around his body, and are somehow able to help him resist the power of the Abyssal Serpent. Additionally, they may also play another role by acting as his eyes. When we first enter the room, it is one of the serpents that studies us, and Mesmer almost seems to see through its eyes that we are tarnished. This would make sense, given his mother has seemingly plucked out his only eye and replaced it with a seal of grace. In the second stage, he is definitely blind, given his seal of grace has been removed. However, whether he's seeing through his winged serpents or the Abyssal Serpent at this stage is unknown. Whatever purpose the winged serpents serve, they are not part of the base serpent, and in fact, they seem to suffer with Mesmer when he releases the Abyssal Serpent. We see them charred by the black flame as well, and they turn from red to white, and Mesmer's helm reads the following: "They were there when the base serpent was sealed behind his eye. They were there through his eternity of suffering. They will accompany him yet in his hideous new form, born when he destroyed the grace granted by his mother. They have accepted his fate as much as have won." With that said, I want to go back to the description of the winged serpent helm, as there are a couple of other things to note here. The description tells us that it's the token creature of Mesmer's military forces, and explains the serpent imagery used by his forces. This opens up an interesting discussion around serpents in general, because we know that serpents were viewed as negative within Erdtree society. So how did Mesmer's forces get away with adorning themselves with serpents? We know from Black Knight Commander Andres' ashes that he and his son, Hef, and others rebelled against Mesmer after learning about his serpentine nature, and this must have been the Abyssal Serpent. His troops must have been fine with his winged serpents that he kept as companions. After all, they were ultimately the sigil that he chose to bear as his coat of arms and the symbol of his military forces. So this wasn't the reason that Hef and Andreas chose to rebel. It must have been discovering the nature of the base serpent within Mesmer. After all, let us not forget the serpent crest shield, a shield meant to commemorate the Crusade, that proudly and overtly sports the serpent upon it. The winged serpents are accepted and even adorned by his troops. The wording around Andres' reason for rebelling about Mesmer's serpentine nature must have meant that the serpent was already viewed as something negative within Erdtree society. We know that gladiatorial games used to be held in the great arenas of Lendel and elsewhere in the lands between, and that the serpent was the object of ire within these games. For example, the duelist helm reads, "Bronze helm decorated with innumerable snakes, worn by gladiators who were driven from the Colosseum. The snake is viewed as a traitor to the Erdtree, and the audience delighted in seeing these bronze effigies beaten and battered." So at some stage, the hatred for snakes was established in Erdtree society to the point that they were routinely and ritually humiliated in the arena, much like how in the UK every November people burn effigies of Guy Fawkes on bonfires. So in the past 2 years of lore study, we have ruminated on what event could have led to this. Why are serpents considered traitors to the Erdtree, bearing in mind that the word traitor means they were once aligned with the Erdtree but somehow betrayed their trust? And now we have to reconcile that lore with how Mesmer, a demigod son of the royal family of the Erdtree, was able to wear serpents proudly upon his coat of arms. One compelling argument is that the serpent may have been involved with the glow-eyed queen, given the presence of a godskin noble at the Temple of Igle, the temple dedicated to the Great Serpent and the serpentine nature of the godskins as well. If the serpent Igle was allied to the godskins and the glow-eyed queen, it could explain why they were considered a traitor to the Erdtree. Whatever the reason you believe that the serpents were viewed as negative by the Erdtree society, We need to somehow explain how Mesmer was able to take the serpent as his symbol in a time like this. Considering the wording of Andres' ashes, this is someone who's clearly loyal to Mesmer, even choosing to leave the Erdtree with Mesmer. And by this time, Mesmer will clearly have been having the snake as his sigil. So why is this not a problem for Andreas, yet his serpentine nature is? If the serpent was already hated by the time the Crusade happened, how do we explain people giving up so much to join Mesmer's side? Well, there are a few possibilities. The first is the most simple one. Mesmer taking a treasonous serpent as his sigil was seen as acceptable, as it's merely a fearsome choice for a coat of arms, a simple but not particularly satisfying explanation. Another explanation is that the serpent was indeed already viewed with suspicion, and Mesmer chose it nonetheless, opening himself up to public criticism. The Fire Knight helm is very interesting here, as it reads, "Each and every knight hailed from a renowned family of the Erdtree's upper echelons, but were shunned and chased from their homes after pledging allegiance to Mesmer as their master," tells us that those who chose to align themselves with Mesmer were immediately disdained, becoming excluded from Erdtree society's upper echelons. Perhaps a large part of this was because of Mesmer's coat of arms. As we will discuss, it seems as though Mesmer willingly took on the role of the Impaler to take the blame for his mother's machinations. His armor set reads, "Black armor of Mesmer the Impaler, draped with a red cloak bearing his crest." Embroidered on his mother's wishes, Mesmer made himself a symbol of fear, undertaking the cleansing crusade she desired. "Direct thy maledictions, thine ire, and thy grief towards me alone." This tells us that Mesmer became this symbol of fear on his mother's wishes. He stylized himself as the Impaler and became this great villain on her orders. Additionally, it has a quote from him that implies Mesmer is wanting those who may hate the Crusade and its actions to direct their hatred towards him alone. It's plausible that the reason those who followed Mesmer were shunned was because Marika publicly distanced herself from the Crusade, allowing Mesmer and his followers to take public blame for such a controversial and brutal campaign, despite the fact she, in reality, ordered Mesmer to do this, a political move that her son readily agreed to. Perhaps his brazen taking of the serpent as his sigil was just a further calculation to draw criticism away from his mother and towards himself. It would have been neat if Mesmer was the reason that the serpent is viewed as a traitor, as this would all line up nicely with what I've just said, that he was publicly blamed for this crusade, and thus he could have been denounced as a traitor, and at that point, going forward, the serpent, his sigil, would have been seen as treasonous to the Erdtree. However, unfortunately, the timeline doesn't seem to line up with this. I've already discussed the fact that the serpent was beaten in the arenas, and this was a practice that was really under Godfrey, and by the time Radagon was Elden Lord, these practices had all but died out. And as I will suggest, Mesmer's crusade took place after the Liurnian Wars and after Radagon's marriage to Renala, and in fact, it may have been after Godfrey and his Tarnished were banished from the lands between, because Mesmer knows what a Tarnished is. If the arenas were closed down by the time Radagon was Elden Lord, this would leave a very small gap between when Godfrey was banished and when Radagon became Elden Lord for Mesmer to go on his crusade and give Serpents their bad name so they were used as effigies in the arena. It just doesn't quite line up as neatly as I'd want it to. However, it is definitely possible that Mesmer is the reason they are viewed as traitors. There are a few other loose ends regarding Serpents I want to talk about. The first is a bit of a mystery discovered by various social media users, a giant snakeskin that can be found near Bonnie Village. What are we to make of this relic? It is too big to be one of the winged serpents of Mesmer, and yet it seems we are meant to somehow connect this to Mesmer. Nearby, you can find the "Oh, Mother" gesture, and the term "Oh, Mother" is one that Mesmer explicitly uses in the Stygidu cinematic of his boss fight. So did Mesmer shed this skin? It is possible that this skin was shed by his Abyssal Serpent, as the size isn't too much of a mismatch, and that is definitely the simplest explanation. However, one can't help but notice it's a very similar model to that of Igle, the god-devouring serpent of Rykard. In fact, the skin is almost the same model as the skin you can find in the temple of Igle. Did this abyssal serpent of Mesmer once give birth to Igle, or are they connected? I can certainly see this abyssal serpent somehow being tied to all serpents. With the discussion of serpents at an end, it's now time to talk about the Crusade itself and the purge of the Terror Folk. Let's discuss the timeline for the Crusade again for completeness' sake. A good place to start is the decorative fire giant heads that can be found on the legs of the furnace golems. If this has been used as the iconography by Mesmer's forces, it means that these must have been constructed after the War of the Giants, and the Crusade must have taken place after this event as well. This war against the fire giants, according to the sword monument on the mountaintops of the giants, marked the end of the Erdtree's initial conquest wars and was the beginning of the age of the Erdtree proper. This means that the Crusade against the Hornsent was not part of the initial wars of the Erdtree when it first emerged, as I had initially assumed pre-release. And because of this iconography alone, we can place the Crusade firmly after the War of the Giants. This does, however, raise questions about Mesmer's potential involvement in this war. We have long speculated about what actually impaled the fire giants. We see their corpses all over the mountaintops of the giants with their bodies pierced by a big spear. Perhaps it was the impaler that impaled the fire giants. However, I'm probably still in the camp that believes that the fire giants were pierced by some thorn sorcery of some kind. Given the arboreal nature of these spears with thorns growing out of them, and the fact that you can find smaller versions of these stakes in the camps that include thorn sorcerers. However, it's an interesting possibility to consider. The Crusade must have come after the Wars of Liurnia, as it must come after the marriage of Radagon and Rennala, which ended those wars. As we've mentioned, Gaius's remembrance tells us that Mesmer was, as an older brother to Radon in his youth, who is of course a son of Rennala and Radagon. And so, if there was a period where Mesmer was as an older brother to Rahan, then his crusade must come after Radagon and Rennala's marriage and the birth of their children. Then we have R'hllana, sister to Rennala, who joined Mesmer, meaning the houses of the Erdtree and the moon must be allies by this stage, as prior to this, they were very hostile to one another. And as such, R'hllana would have been unlikely to ally with Mesmer before this. R'hllana's helmet even tells us that she gets the blessing of her older sister, Rennala, which definitely wouldn't have happened had the houses of the Erdtree and the moon still been at war. I placed this crusade as later during the Erdtree era, prior to the Shattering, but after the Tarnished and Godfrey were banished from these lands. I've mentioned this already, but Mesmer knows exactly what a Tarnished is, meaning he must have been around for Godfrey and his warriors being banished. Tarnished is a specific term, and we know that Mesmer could likely recognize that we are Graceless. But the fact he uses this specific term against us means he must know what a Tarnished is, and thus he must have been there for Godfrey's banishment. However, it must have been in the period before Radagon became Elden Lord. The description for Rennala's set reads, "When Rennala, head of both the Academy of Raya Lucaria and the Carian royal family, lost her husband Radagon, her heart went along with him. And then those at the Academy realized that Rennala was no champion after all. Muriel expands upon what happened to Rennala after Radagon left her. Sadly, her heart was broken when Lord Radagon left her. And then, when the Academy rebelled against the royals, she was locked away in the Grand Library. In the end, Lady Rennala was left alone, cradling the amber egg Lord Radagon bequeathed her. Now she devotes herself to it through forbidden rite, the grim art of reincarnation too. After Radagon left her, she fell into despair, cradling the amber egg he left behind. And aside from this, she was stripped of her power and imprisoned by Raya Lucaria. Thus, it's very unlikely that R'hllana would have left her at this point, if her sister was in prison, nor would she have received her sister's blessing as is described by Rowlina's helmet after this time. So yes, it must be after Godfrey was banished, but before Radagon had returned to the Erdtree capital and become Elden Lord. This is pretty solid evidence in of itself, but there are some other hints and clues that reinforce the fact that Mesmer's crusade took place later on in the timeline. For example, we have Rykard's virgin abductors present at the Fort of Reprimand, again meaning that Rykard had been born, grown up, and had developed his ideology enough to create these monstrous contraptions that he clearly lent to his stepbrother Mesmer for this crusade. Additionally, there are Omen killers at the Fort of Reprimand, and the Omen killers are a part of an ideology that developed later on in Erdtree history, as we know from the Crucible Knight gauntlets that the things of the Crucible were not disdained initially. It was after some time that they became disdained, and thus the Omen killers would be a product of later Erdtree ideology. And I'm sure no one has any trouble accepting that this took place before the Shattering, the Crusade I mean. But there is another detail that does reinforce this. Mesmer does not drop a great rune, and not only does that make his power level very impressive, because he is exerting his power without being boosted by a great rune, but it also means that he was already sealed in the land of shadow by the time of the Shattering, as he never claimed a great rune like the other demigods. With that said about the timeline, let us talk about Mesmer's role within the Crusade itself. We've already looked at Mesmer's armor set, which tells us that Mesmer became the Impaler, a symbol of fear that's clearly modeled on Vlad the Impaler, on his mother's orders. Additionally, we get further corroborating evidence that it was Queen Marika who ordered Mesmer to do this crusade via Leda, who says the following: "Long ago, Queen Marika commanded Sir Mesmer to purge the Tower folk, and so Mesmer decked himself out in red, took the serpent as his symbol, and would spread fear and death through the land of shadow with his impaling spears and his black flame." But what was the impetus for this crusade? Well, there are two main reasons as I see it. First of all is the most obvious, to destroy those without grace and bury Marika's secrets with it. And the second reason is to get rid of Mesmer, who Marika feared because of the abyss within him. Let's start with reason number one, the public reason for the crusade, the cleansing of the Graceless. The term crusade in and of itself tells us that this was a war not for conquest or political reasons. Rather, it's a war prosecuted in line with a belief system or a religion. To the most zealous of this crusade, it was a sacred duty, killing those without grace. The term sacred is even used in the Crusaders' insignia. We know from the base game lore that those associated with the Crucible and without grace were eventually persecuted under the Golden Order's regime. A good primary source for this is found in the Crucible talismans of Knot, Scale, and Feather, which read, "A vestige of the Crucible of primordial life." Born partially of devolution, it was considered a signifier of the divine in ancient times, but is now increasingly disdained as an impurity as civilization has advanced D3. And we see this persecution everywhere in the contextual evidence. The Omen are imprisoned deep below Leyndell or have their horns excised. We also have the misbegotten enslaved at places like Castle Morn and otherwise. They are pushed out to the fringes of Grace Society to areas like the consecrated snowfield and the Halig Tree. Likewise, the Crucible Knights of Godfrey, heroes of their time, are steadily pushed out and disdained for their power, a fact that we learn from their gauntlet item descriptions. What this gauntlet and the aforementioned talismans tell us is the surface reason for the hate, the aesthetic reasons. The age of the Erdtree is a time of civilization and conformity, and as one lore enthusiast put it, the Crucible is the age of evolution. Those of the age of the Erdtree believe that they've reached the perfect image, the perfect stage of evolution, and everything else that came before them is barbaric or chaotic, unlike the refined image of man that exists under the Golden Order. But the hatred runs a little deeper, and the Omen are a good entry point into understanding this reason. The Remembrance of Morgott reads, "Though born one of the Graceless Omen, Morgott took it upon himself to become the Erdtree's protector." The Omen, like Morgott, are graceless, and we can understand how if we look more closely at the Dung Eater's quest and what he does. The Dung Eater is, of course, inspired by the Omen, the outcasts of Erdtree society, and one can see that from his Omen-inspired armor. And as such, he spreads their curse. When he kills someone, he defiles their corpse, and they are afflicted with the seedbed curse, this description of which reads, "Curse grown on a corpse killed and defiled by the Dung Eater. A tender pox afflicted with omen horns." The Dung Eater cultivates the seedbed curse on corpses. By doing so, he prevents dead souls returning to the Erdtree, leaving them forever cursed. One of the most loathsome things found in all the land's Betafern. So, part of the Omen curse is that they are essentially not part of the cycle of life that goes through the Erdtree, and this is a massive issue for people in Leyndell society, as they see the Erdtree as the divine nexus of life for everything in the lands between. The reason they hate the Omen is similar to the reason that they hate the Albinaurics. The Albinauric bloodclot reads, "Albinaurics are life forms made by human hands. Thus many believe them to live impure lives, untouched by the Erdtree's grace. They are untouched by the Erdtree's grace because they are artificially created. Anything graceless or disconnected from the Erdtree is seen as impure, whether it be Omen or artificial creatures. This hatred runs so deep that even the blood of graceless beings is seen as dirty or tainted." For example, the Albinauric pot reads, "The Knights of the Cuckoo do declare, behold thy defiled blood, unlike any humor that flows in our grand realm." Likewise, we can see the hatred that the self-hating Morgott has for his own tainted blood, as he says the following in his Phase-2 transition when his Omen blood is unleashed and spills all over the thrones of the Erdtree. "The thrones, stained by my curse, such shame I cannot bear. Thy part in this shall not be forgiven." This disgust of beings that are graceless clearly carries over into this crusade, as they go to slaughter the Hornsent, clearly an Omen equivalent people whose blood is likewise corrupted. We know that the Crucible's power is still strong in the Land of Shadow, and that its influence causes creatures to grow horns. The Beast Horn item reads, "The Crucible has a particularly strong influence on the beasts of the Realm of Shadow, causing many to grow horns despite the characteristics of their species." The Hornsent are very much like the Omen in that they grow horns as a result of the Crucible's influence. They are not part of the Erdtree system. To the most zealous of Erdtree society, these Hornsent would be no better than the Omen that are already persecuted underneath them. With this in mind, I find the item description for the Black Knight helm very interesting, as it reads, "Helm worn by the Black Knights, servants of Mesmer the Impaler, black iron ornamented with gold. A rotten odor stubbornly clings to it. Perhaps it arises from the tainted nature of the blood that splattered upon it, or perhaps it is the wearer's own blackened soul festering after endless slaughter." 5i enjoy the commentary of this item description, as it plays upon the perception of the beholder. Is it the rotten smell of the blood of the unclean, or is it a soul burdened with brutal murder? Either way, it alludes to this anti-grace sentiment that would have been at the forefront for the believers of the Crusade, that those of the Hornsent are graceless and their blood impure. And to me, it makes perfect sense that the Omen killers are also here, part of this crusade. To them, the Hornsent would be no different from their usual quarry. Indeed, this Gracepurity dogma is repeated by one of the most zealous warriors of the crusade, Fire Knight Queeline, who says the following, "Those stripped of the grace of gold shall all meet death in the embrace of Mesmer's flame." This war was a purge, with those leading it believing strongly in the cause, lining up with the anti-crucible sentiment of the modern Golden Order fundamentalists. These crusaders clearly came here for Queen Marika, setting up idols and churches in her name, cleansing the lands of the Graceless, a stain on her rule. Marika is the goddess of grace, ultimately, and thus a crusade undertaken to destroy those bereft of grace is a cause in her name. As such, they bring their Marika worship with them. This is a crusade, a religious crusade after all. We have the Church of the Crusade, found in Scadu Altus, that has a statue of Marika at its heart. The Crusaders brought their religion with them, and this church clearly acted as a hub for the Marika faithful as they persecuted their business. Hence why Fire Knight Queeline is praying directly to Queen Marika in multiple instances. He is under the impression that he is serving her directly by killing the Graceless, a stain on her grace. Favor me with thy grace. I have met many who would threaten or distress thee and quelled each and all, and I hereby swear to never cease. So please, grant me thy grace. Leave me with my solitary light. Mesmer also seems to buy into this dogma, as he fights us on the basis of the fact that we are graceless, despite the fact his mother has elected us as the new Elden Lord. His belief runs so deep that he will not stomach an Elden Lord that is tarnished. Even if his mother has chosen them, he goes as far as to unleash the Abyssal Serpent to stop us. At the end of it all, he does curse his mother, so perhaps he was just holding on to this hatred and belief because he had to, because otherwise, all the terrible acts he committed in his mother's name were for nothing. He committed a horrible slaughter in his mother's name, taking the blame, and he had to believe in the cause in order to perpetrate these crimes. Otherwise, he would never have gotten through it. But if his mother has elected a graceless lord anyway, how important could this cause have really been? As I suggested earlier, I believe the second and potentially main reason that Marika asked Mesmer to do this was so she would have a chance to seal Mesmer off in the land of shadow. So perhaps to her it was meaningless in the first place. But we'll talk more about that later. Let us now talk about those who actually participated in this crusade, as there's a lot of interesting details to the players involved. At the top of the Crusade's command structure are two characters of great renown. The first of which is Gaius, Mesmer's friend from years past and a student of the Alabaster Lord of Celia. Gaius was the overall commander of Mesmer's forces. No surprise, given his martial prowess and the bond of trust that would exist between him and the Impaler, all details that we get from his remembrance. Gaius also had a friendly rivalry with Rodin, but was the most senior of his disciples, and as such, he is able to unleash some pretty powerful gravitational spells, almost on the level of Rodin. Additionally, we know Gaius was an Albinauric, and we learn this via his greaves that drop from the Albinauric found behind his arena. One can't help but wonder if this Albinauric was his companion or friend, but either way, the item description explains the reason he is mounted upon a boar all the time. Like the female and older Albinaurics, he hasn't got the use of his legs. I do wonder how much Mesmer actually believed truly in the Crusade's cause. Here he is, purging those who are graceless and cursing out the tarnished when we meet him, while his right-hand man is a graceless, artificial being. But Gaius is the start of a pattern that those closest to Mesmer are very loyal to him, willing to give up a lot. He is someone who commands great loyalty, and that pattern continues with our second figure, at the top of his command structure, Rellana, known as Mesmer's Blade, who brought a whole contingent of Carrion Lazuli sorcerers and troll knights with her, bolstering Mesmer's ranks with much-needed magical support. Then we have the elite Fire Knights, those who serve directly under Mesmer, and their closeness to Mesmer is why we find them all throughout the specimen storehouse, where Mesmer himself is located. It's clear that those who belong to the Fire Knights were those who knew Mesmer best, as the armor set for the Fire Knights reads, Armor of the Fire Knights under Mesmer the Impaler's personal command, distinguished by its red cape and twin golden snakes, which adorn the neck, enhancing incantations of Mesmer's flame. These were the only ones who truly knew Mesmer, his flames like serpents, the painful fate that accompanied his accursed form. So this is truly fascinating. The Fire Knights are those that knew Mesmer's darkest secrets. The implication of this armor set is clear. They knew the truth about what lay within Mesmer, his flame, and the Abyssal Serpent. They know the reason why his flames move like a serpent. As a result of knowing him so intimately, their armor set and armaments reflect Mesmer. They adorn themselves in his twin serpents. They wear his red cape, and they are able to use Mesmer's incantations rather than just using the usable item. Fire coil, like the basic soldiery have to do. These are close confidants and friends to Mesmer, those he trusts implicitly with his darkest secrets. We've already looked at the Fire Knight helm, but to reiterate the lore contained within it, these knights all came from the Erdtree aristocracy of Lendel, coming from noble backgrounds themselves. It means that these families likely knew Mesmer before the war, moving in the same circles as the royal family during peacetime. It would therefore make sense that they have an existing relationship with him, a reason to be loyal to him to the point where they would abandon everything, their title and their status, to follow him. What I really like about the Fire Knights is it's not just a homogeneous group. There are different sects and ranks within this elite circle. There are specific characters that stand out. It's almost like the Round Table of King Arthur. For example, we do have the standard Fire Knights with their pointed helms, but there are individuals among the Fire Knights who have their own affectations and style. For example, there is Y found in the Church District, and his death mask helm reads, Helm of Y, Elder among the Fire Knights. 2 warped death masks stacked one atop the other. Gnawed by loneliness, the old man turned his attention to the spirituality of Mesmer's flame, using it in a rite of resurrection. Yet the soulless bodies he brought to life were no comfort to Y. And so yeah, this is the practice of necromancy that can be achieved through Mesmer's flame that I alluded to earlier with Y, this specialized Fire Knight, using Mesmer's flame as a spiritual medium to resurrect the dead, as we see him do in the Church District. And Y is not the only specialized individual within the Fire Knights. We have other characters, like the Captain of the Knights, Cud, who wears the unique helm of the winged serpents and guards the doors to Mesmer's chamber. Then we have one of the most zealous members, Queen, whose loyalty to the cause goes above Mesmer as he sees himself as a servant of Marika herself, striking down the Graceless in her name. However, not all members of the Fire Knights were so extreme. Some were seemingly more reflective about the slaughter that they were committing. There is a special member of the Fire Knights who we fight when crossing the bridge to Raw Base. Salza is a sage of the Fire Knights who seems to have more impressive command of Mesmer's incantations than other knights. And we learn a little bit about this sage from his hood item description, which reads, Hood of Salza, Sage of the Fire Knights. A prestigious amount of cloth wound around it, giving the impression of a greatly swollen head. A disciple of the Elder Y, he refused to burn down an old ruin at the risk of his own life. Salza is a sage of the Fire Knights, and seems to have a more impressive command of Mesmer's incantations than any other knight, and we see this display of power when we try to cross the bridge into Ra, where he rains down fire from above. This makes sense, given his hood explains that he is a disciple of Y, the Elder Knight we just discussed. Y himself used Mesmer's flame in very creative and powerful ways, and so it makes sense that Salza, being his disciple, would also have a great command over its power. But Salza's destructive power is a contrast to his temperament, as again looking at his hood's item description, we can see that he was reluctant to destroy a certain town using his power. Additionally, we get further insight into this character via his iconic incantation, A Rain of Fire, which reads, Salza's disdain for barbarism never waned, even as he burned more villages and scorched more land than any other. Salza clearly did his part as a crusader and knight loyal to Mesmer, but clearly hated wanton violence. And as such, it was Salza and those who agreed with him that would push for the specimen storehouse to be a thing. We learn of this from the Ashes of Fire Knight Hilda, which reads, Hilda was a dear friend to Salza the sage, and joined those who urged that the specimens be preserved. Hilda's ashes were enshrined as a charm to protect the storehouse. there was clearly a faction within the Fire Knights, led by Salza and Hild, that felt some kind of remorse over what they were doing. And while the Specimen Hall isn't exactly an emotional tribute to the slaughtered Hornsent, to people like Salza and Hild, it was the least they could do to at least preserve the memory of those they were exterminating in one form or another, even if it was just for history's sake. The fact that an entire Specimen Hall was constructed within the Black Keep shows how much influence these Fire Knights actually had with Mesmer, as Mesmer clearly would have had to greenlight this project, as it's within his own keep. And this would be a pretty massive undertaking. And so, to be able to convince Mesmer the Impaler to be able to do this, they must have been pretty close to him. These are close members of Mesmer's inner circle, people of immense influence in his court and likely his friends. As I've been saying, we know Mesmer wasn't an aloof lord. He had close relationships with his closest allies, like R'hllana, like Gaius, and like these Fire Knights. Additionally, we know that he valued members of his Black Knights as well, specifically Captain Hef. Hef was the son of Black Knight Commander Andreas, and his ashes tell us that he joined his father in rebellion against Mesmer. But as a result, Mesmer mourned the loss of a comrade in arms. He mourned the death of this Hef. The fact he would have camaraderie with a Black Knight who wasn't even a part of his inner circle tells us a lot about Mesmer's character. R'hllana, Andreas, Gaius, the Fire Knights, they all made a choice to follow Mesmer into this crusade, despite knowing what it would cost them in regards to their standing in the land between. Let us talk about the Black Knights and Mesmer's soldiers, since we are essentially doing a full breakdown of all of those who followed Mesmer. Unlike the inner circle of Mesmer, who wear the red of their lord, the bulk of his armies actually wear black etched with gold. Both the description of the knight armor set and the Mesmer soldier set essentially say the same thing. The armor is black with only a touch of gold, the gold of the Erdtree sigil, and this little bit of gold was to offer them solace in their duty, in the perpetration of a war without honor or grace. I take this to mean that the black of their uniform is reflective of their grim duty and purpose. They are here as executioners. This is not a glorious war to be sung about in years to come. It is brutal. It is slaughter. Unlike the fiercely loyal Fire Knights, the lore soldiery of Mesmer's army aren't all here out of choice. The face masks of Mesmer's soldiers read, a small consolation to those forced to wage a war without grace or honor. The fact they are forced to be here makes more sense if we read the Mesmer soldier ashes. As they elaborate on this detail, they read, these soldiers belonged to the ignoble penal battalion and were buried hidden from the Erdtree's sight. A penal battalion, meaning the soldiers of Mesmer's army are ex-convicts. Hence, they were made to fight this war for Marika. This is a win-win if she's planning to get rid of Mesmer and seal him in these lands anyway. Then why not empty your jails while you're at it? Additionally, given the distasteful nature of this crusade, aside from the zealous few, and those really loyal to Mesmer, I don't imagine you'd get a lot of warriors volunteering for this crusade, and as such, the ranks were filled with the unwilling. But what about the Black Knights? We know from Andres' ash that these warriors made up the majority of Mesmer's forces. They were the bread and butter and backbone of his fighting force. And clearly, Mesmer took some time out of his day to interact with some of them, like Hif, and those like Andreas were indeed loyal. Yet, the Knight set also says that these warriors were forced to fight in this war, similar to the regular soldiers. So what's the deal here? Were they also prisoners? Unlike the Fire Knights and the Mesmer soldiers, we do not know what category of society these knights came from. Now, the simple explanation could be that they were already part of Mesmer's fighting force, and they were just forced to go along with this as part of his commands. Yet there's another possible, more interesting explanation. Andres' and House ashes tell us that they had command over the powers of the Crucible, and indeed, other Black Knights also have an association with the Crucible. Sub-bosses like Black Knight, Edred also summoned the powers of the Crucible, in his case manifesting as wings. Now, admittedly, the basic Black Knights we face in great numbers do not seem to use Crucible powers, but what if, in general, these knights are somehow associated with the Crucible? Not exactly Crucible knights, but warriors and practitioners linked to Crucible powers. If true, their place in the capital could be tenuous, and thus perhaps any Cruciblesque warrior was pushed into becoming a Black Knight. So again, this would be a win-win for Leyndell, getting rid of their prisoners and any other associations with the Crucible in one fell swoop. It's just a fun theory, of course, but it would explain why the Black Knights seem to have some loose connection to the Crucible. Whatever the reasons for being here, whether they were forced or they were part of Mesmer's army already, they certainly are stalwart in their duty. For example, the Black Knight shield reads, symbol of their iron conviction. In their crusade, the Black Knights will never yield, nor will they ever doubt their purpose. These knights are not like the conscripted prisoners of the lower ranks. They are men of conviction, and it shows in their fearsome combat prowess and their stoic nature in dishing out this brutal slaughter. They are unyielding in their loyalty to their lord and unwavering in the prosecution of their duty, no matter how grim that might be. The Black Knight shield says, nor will they ever doubt their purpose. And this is clearly how these knights operated when they were perpetrating their slaughter against an entire people. They just got their heads down and did the job in front of them. However, the Black Knight helm that we looked at earlier very much hints that despite this, it'll have no doubt weighed heavily on them in the deepest recesses of their psyche. Finally, of course, we have the furnace golems, the final constituent part of Mesmer's crusade. These are fearsome instruments of war that assisted in burning the lands of the Hornsent and the Hornsent themselves. We do get some information about these monstrosities, starting with the furnace visage, which reads, a stone mask surrounded by curled horns, depicting the fell god of fire that haunts the sagas of the Hornsent. So, the fell god of fire of the Hornsent sagas suggests that this is a god of their mythology and culture, one that scared them, that haunted them. However, given it is the fell god of fire, it makes almost certain that this is the same fell god that is associated with the fire giants, but it's just interpreted and portrayed in a different way from a separate culture. This likelihood is compounded by the fact that there are fire giant effigies found on the legs of these furnace golems. The Erdtree culture has a history of portraying the fire giants on weapons of fire, such as the cultural impact that the fire giants had on Leyndell. As such, Mesmer's forces carry on this tradition by putting the fire giants on this new weapon of fire, alongside the fell god, which is feared by the Hornsent. And this is a scare tactic, and isn't something new for Erdtree culture either. The Omen smirk mask of the Omen killers is said to portray a spirit which haunts the Omen in their dreams, and again is another brutal scare tactic for those they hunt. To add to the horror, these furnace golems are actually animated, even in their faces. The faceplate of the furnace golem is usually stoic, and you would be forgiven for thinking it's just a still carving. However, if you knock them down and hurt them, they open their mouths in fear or despair. And so, one can only imagine how horrifying these would have been to face for the Hornsent. These monsters are probably being animated by the magic of Mesmer's flame. We've already discussed when looking at how Mesmer's flame has some interesting uses, how he was able to use it to resurrect the dead, no doubt a side effect of the power of dark that's within Mesmer's flame. And so why couldn't it be used to animate these golems? We know it's Mesmer's flame that is within them, rather than just regular flame, because we can make a smaller version of these furnaces in the hefty furnace pot, and one of its ingredients includes Mesmer's embers. Additionally, part of the furnace golem's ingredients is Erdtree sap, something we can learn of by reading any of the new tiers, which are dropped by the furnace golems, and they read, a crystal tier formed slowly over the ages where the scattered sap of the Erdtree pools deep within the furnace golems. The combination of Mesmer's dark flame and the dark-tinted sap of the Scadu-tree had a rather sinister effect. As the hefty furnace pot reads, "The furnace's flame burns away both body and soul. When impurity is thus expunged, one calls it cleansing." We look deeply at the dark and the abyss in the prior chapters, and therefore, the furnace golems having the power of the dark within them, both in the form of the Scadu-tree, sap, and Mesmer's flame, should be significant to you. The fires that burn within the furnace golems are not normal, fueled by the Scadu-tree, and the abyssal-touched flame of Mesmer. Even the souls of those who are burned are also destroyed. This was meant to be a thorough cleansing, and so Mesmer unleashed his flame, his spears, his men, and his furnace golems upon the land, an apocalyptic event that we see unfold in the story trailer, the finale of which seemed to be the impaling of the divine beasts, the pinnacle of Hornsent culture, and the best of their horned warriors. There are only 2 divine beasts left by the time we arrive in the Land of Shadow, the one at Balurat, and one found in the ancient ruins of Rar, and we learn why there are so few of these divine beasts left thanks to Divine Beast Tornado, which reads, "The majority of divine beasts were gored and hung upon Mesmer's spears, then burned in his flame. Those who witnessed the deed likened it to a funeral pyre for the tower itself." Mesmer's crusade was thorough, and it wasn't just Balurat that was destroyed, it was the other towns of the Hornsent that exist within the Land of Shadow. All that remains of the Hornsent culture is a few survivors and the specimens that are strung up in the Black Keep. The rest were impaled upon Mesmer's iconic spear. And before we move on, I do want to talk about Mesmer's iconic weapon, because there's one detail that I really like. Mesmer is able to throw his spear and recall it to his hand at will. He's also able to make copies of it, and again, it reappears in his hand. And this is like the smith script weapons that we can find in the Land of Shadow. And there is a reason this is the case. It's because it's made the same way. The item description for the Spear of the Impaler reads, "Were made by the forging arts of the realm of Shadow," meaning it was made here in the Land of Shadow, using the ancient smith script techniques of the forges. Whether he made this during his crusade or prior to it, when there was peace here, is up for debate, but it's certainly ironic that Mesmer is using the ancient arts of these lands to slaughter its people. And yet, despite the total destruction of these people, and the crusade essentially achieving its goals, Mesmer and the Crusaders are still here to this day. In fact, Mesmer even has a throne that mirrors the one of the Elden Lord in Leyndell, showing that he has essentially settled here as the Lord of the Land of Shadow. This isn't a temporary crusade anymore. These lands are his home and domain. We've mentioned this a few times now, but the reason that Mesmer is still here is because his mother has sealed him here. Marika wanted Mesmer to be sealed in these lands, and he is not remaining here by choice. He, the Abyssal Serpent, and the original Sin are all safely tucked away from Leyndell in the Lands of Grace. There is evidence that the Crusaders were unexpectedly trapped here via 2 ghost dialogues that we get. The first is found in Castle Ensis, where a soldier is begging Queen Marika to reach out to her son, Mesmer, so the crusade could end. Then there is the ghost of a Black Knight in the Black Keep who laments and is in denial. Surely Queen Marika would not abandon them there, as Mesmer is her own son. The Crusaders likely expected to come on this holy war and then be allowed to return home. And I suspect that this frustration at Marika's abandonment is the reason that every statue of Queen Marika in the Land of Shadow is defaced, including ones in the Black Keep. This could only be done by Mesmer's soldiers. No Hornsent have access to this keep. I think it's frustration at the fact they have been abandoned. The only one that actually has its head intact is the one in Mesmer's room, and this is because of the love and loyalty that Mesmer still has for his mother. One thing we do need to discuss is the actual mechanics of how Mesmer was sealed here. We know from pre-DLC interviews with Miyazaki that the Land of Shadow is physically disconnected from the Lands Between. meaning they did used to be attached to the rest of the lands between. But they have now become disconnected somehow. And we know from the flavor text of the DLC on the Bandai Namco website itself that these lands are obscured by the Erdtree, and having talked about the relevance of shadow and the Erdtree, we can definitely see how this is possible mechanically. The power of shadow and the dark does have the power to obscure, just like the sealing tree was used to hide and obscure the Tower of Shadow. The story trailer tells us that gold and shadow were born at the same time. I take this to mean that the moment that Marika became a god, her system of dualities came into being. With the Erdtree came the Erdtree. With gold came shadow. And so my initial thought was that at the same moment that the Erdtree was born, these lands would have been shrouded and removed, as that does cosmically make sense. However, there are some issues here if we accept that as the reality. We know that it is extremely difficult to travel to the land of shadow when it's behind the veil. Mikhella, one of the most powerful beings of this era, needs to jump through a lot of hoops in order to gain access to this realm. He has to bewitch Moog into defiling his body, removing its grace with his tainted Omen blood. If Mikhella has such problems reaching the land of shadow, then how can we explain Mesmer coming here with a huge army? Well, of course, we could just explain it away to Queen Marika having powers that allowed their transportation here. At the end of the day, she is the vessel of the Elden Ring and the god of this system of gold and shadow. Surely, she would have the powers to transport people across the veil. Then we could explain Mesmer's sealing as her just leaving them here and not bringing them back. However, some might not find this explanation satisfying, and I'm starting not to. So let us consider the other side of the argument, that the land of shadow was not immediately obscured when the Erdtree came into existence, and in fact, the lands of shadow and the lands of Leyndell lay alongside one another for a period of time. This would definitely explain a lot of things, and there's one particular character in general that makes me think that this is the most likely explanation: Crucible Knight Darien. She is found in the ruins of Ra, and her helmet reads, "It is said Darien quested in search of the Crucible's origin and departed from the lands of the Erdtree alone. Is it not far more likely that the land of shadow was not initially veiled, and she was able to walk here from the lands of Leyndell in a period after she had served Lord Godfrey, and in that period, as described by the Crucible Knight gauntlets, where the Crucible Knights began to become disdained? Would this not be the most likely moment where she would travel from Leyndell and go to the land of shadow? To sum up, her presence is easier to understand if the land of shadow was once attached to Leyndell, and she simply traveled here normally. Additionally, if Leyndell and Belurat once existed alongside each other in a period of peace, it could also explain some other certain cultural overlaps. We've discussed already how the Crusade clearly took place later on in the timeline, and this must mean that Belurat was allowed to exist. Indeed, the item description of festive garb implies as much as it reads, "The delightful festival is an old tradition, one old enough for the Erdtree to tacitly tolerate its endurance." This highly suggests that the people of the Hornsent and the Land of Shadow were under the rule of the Erdtree for some time, and for a period of time they were able to carry on their old traditions. Indeed, this cultural overlap is further emphasized by the dueling shield, which reads, "An armament once used in ritual combat performed to honor the Erdtree, a custom that had somehow remained within the realm of shadow." To me, it seems highly unlikely that this cultural import, ritual and arena combat, could be transferred from Leyndell to Belurat if they were separated by a veil from the very beginning of the Erdtree's reign. Finally, another thing to consider is the veil that we see in the sky. The veil very much is a reflection of the canopy that is in Marika's bedchamber in Leyndell. The imagery is quite clear. This veil that hangs over the land of shadow is clearly the literal veil that obscures it from the rest of the lands between, and given it has an oblique tie to Marika, It implies that she actively put this shroud in place rather than it being a natural consequence of the Erdtree and Scadutree's creation. This narrative would suggest, therefore, that Mesmer and his armies marched on Beluret from Lindell as normal, and as soon as they crossed the border into the realm of shadow, Marika placed a veil over the land, sealing Mesmer and his army in there forever. I think this is where I stand currently on the issue of the shroud. I think Darien's presence is a big one for me. Whatever the mechanism by which Mesmer was sealed in the land of shadow, I believe that Marika's true goal with the Crusade that she wanted Mesmer to undertake wasn't really the destruction of the Hornsent. That is just a byproduct of it. She wanted to have her son sealed away somewhere. She saw the darkness within him and wanted him removed from the lands of grace. Additionally, it would also allow her original sin, her betrayal and ascension to godhood, to be hidden as well. Mesmer still holds true to his mother, or at least is trying to. As I said, the one statue of Marika that is not beheaded in the land of shadow is the one in his chamber. A statue of Marika cradling her child. Given it's in his throne room, we can only conclude that this is a statue depicting Marika with Mesmer, a tender moment that Mesmer clearly still holds dear. Mesmer's relationship with his mother is clearly complex, and in many ways, it's one of the most important parts of his identity. He did all of this for his mother, becoming a reviled symbol of fear, staining his hands with blood, and taking the public flak for it while she could remain squeaky clean, somewhat. Even at the end, when he is challenged by her lord, a graceless tarnished no less, he begs for her forgiveness when he unleashes the Abyssal Serpent within him. It's only finally at the end of it all, at the moment of his death, that he finally curses his mother, Marika, a curse upon thee, and who can blame him? Mesmer stayed true to the mission his mother gave him, committing horrible crimes, mass murder, and still holding true to her even after she abandoned him there for God knows how long. And it's only at the moment of his death, when he is struck down by Marika's lord-elect, that he curses her, realizing it was all for nothing. It was a facade. He stained his soul killing the Graceless for his mother, truly believing in the cause, only for a Graceless tarnished to be chosen by Marika and kill him. Such is the story of Mesmer, the abandoned and forgotten child of Marika. I'm hesitant to call it tragic, because whether or not he was reluctant to do these things, he did still undertake these brutal acts of murder. But, as with all Elden Ring characters, there is nuance to him. He is the brutal impaler, but he is also the abandoned son, afflicted with a monster within him from birth. Both of these things can be true at once, and it's the result of the masterful writing by George R.R. Martin and Miyazaki, and it helps round out the roster of demi-god children very well, and helps complete the story of Elden Ring. So that is my take on Mesmer the Impaler, a fascinating character that fills a unique role within the Elden Ring pantheon.